It cannot be told for certainty the evolution of the population of the Great Britain throughout their history. But for what it seems, along Middle Age to the first century of modern age, there was a rise. In the 17th century, the phenomenon of immigration had manifested itself, but for England and for Wales, the losses related to the population departure in an isolated way were motivated by specific reasons, such as religion causes. In the 1620s, it was the beginning of the population decreasing. At the beginning of the 18th century, the most densely populated areas were confined to counties that benefited from good possibilities of agricultural exploitation. Being endowed with a climate that was not too humid, that is, in western front of England and of Scotland. The Industrial Revolution, which precisely in Great Britain had its first manifestations around that time, was accompanied hand in hand by the demographic revolution, which tripled the population of England and Wales in just 1 century. This increase was possible thanks to a sudden and strong reduction in mortality. Still a bit difficult to interpret today, as it is predated the spread of medical progress. But besides the strong reduction in mortality, they were able to maintain a high birth rate. By the 20th century, with the restrictions imposed by the United States on immigration in 1913, the First World War and a serious economic crisis of the 30s caused disruptions and numerical abundance. Also, there was the increased mobility of masses and the ease of information, brought into contact excessively constructing ways of life and economic and social situations, stimulating the more entrepreneurs to go looking elsewhere to improve their own living conditions. In less than a century, the British Islands lost around 15 million inhabitants. The trend towards migration was accentuated again after World War II because of socio-economic difficulties that the United Kingdom went through. Thus, the average of about 200,000 immigrants per year was reached once again, with the prevailing destination being the Commonwealth countries such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and to the United States and Western European countries, of course. On the other hand, since 1955, there have been strong immigration flows in Great Britain. England has become increasingly clearly a country of strong attraction, dominant in the rest of Europe. But how this reflected on their urbanization? The natural movement of the population did not register significant trends, reversals between the 20th and the 21st century. The birth rate, which had reached quite low values already in the mid-70s, being that it was 13% per year in 1973, reduced in dropped even further to 11% in 2002, while mortality declined even further. It reduced in an almost equivalent measure, going from 12 to 10%. Consequently, natural growth stood at around 1% in 2002. The traction of the birth rate was remarkably transformed the age composition of the population. These recent demographic changes imply consequences in terms of social policies, the organization of space, and the economic in the broad sense. The aging of the population created the need to reorganize care and hospital services. The pension system was also put to the test by the progressive decrease in the number of workers. At the same time, the elderly represented a new segment of demand aimed at the market for consumer goods and entertainment, as demonstrated by the increase in travel for elderly. In general, the growth of small families expanded significantly. Whether made up of single, elderly, or young people, this resulted in an increase in demand for housing, when it should have decreased since there was a demographic decline. Interestingly, it was also possible to identify a geographic of fixation of these social demographic groups, in particular of the elderly, who tend to concentrate in some more favorable areas from the climatic point of view, such as tourist cities of the south coast of England, while families made up of young adults, on the other hand, show a certain preference for urban contexts, and especially when they have high incomes, for restored neighborhoods of historic centers. But let's talk about immigrants in England. Although the number of entries has been constantly higher than that of exits, direct migratory flows to the United Kingdom have significantly reduced, standing at around 370,000 individuals per year in the first years of the 21st century. From the 1980s onwards, with the National Act, the British government initiated a policy to contain immigration, who slowed down, however, the phases of recession that the country went through also contributed for the contradiction of jobs accompanied by decline in industrialization. The presence of a multi-ethnic society and a considerable number of second-generation immigrants is the result of a long history of immigration. Even though most citizens don't admit to this, immigration plays a significant role in their society. Most of their cultural nowadays is a reflection of years and years of immigration history. If the capital is a mirror of plurality of nationalities and ethnicities present in British society, on the other hand, one can also find significant concentrations of immigrants, mainly Pakistanians, in the textile cities of Lancashire, Warwickshire, and the Western Midlands. Within urban areas, ethnic minorities tend to be concentrated in the most run-down central neighborhoods, where the real estate assets have not yet undergone redevelopment process, and therefore the rental values are low. As in other European countries, immigrants find work in low-skilled and poorly paid jobs, which the local population refuses to do. Therefore, they are the first to be affected in periods of economic downturn. In the case of the United Kingdom, however, the multiplicity of behavior models and the direction of the immigration phenomenon make it possible to identify exceptions to this rule. The most significant example is present precisely by the Indians, who conquered professional positions of a certain importance in commerce, in the hotel industry, and in the liberal professions. The other groups are less dynamic, being employed in industry, in low-skilled public services, and in families as domestic help. But as any other country, there is external immigration, but what about internal ones? The demographic increase in the United Kingdom did not only determine the formation of strong migratory currents abroad, but also gave a rise to massive internal migrations, which resulted in very accentuated urbanization phenomenon and great desertification of rural areas. Industrial development and the mobility of the population led the population to concentrate in a few restricted areas. There was the creation of this movement called the Drift to the South, that is a movement towards the active and more dynamic regions, combined with a progressive expansion towards the urban fringes of the English central southern cities. The drift to the south must be related to the changes in the geography of production that occurred in the period between the two world conflicts, which, with the emergence of new industrial sectors, such as the consumer service supplies industry, such as electricity, the mechanical, pharmaceutical, construction, food and clothing industry. These industries were located preferably in the southeast and the Midlands, supplanted many areas of the 19th century industrialization devoted to the coal and heavy industry. Although the drift to the south after the 70s had lost much of its intensity at the level that it was, the current distribution of the population had remained quite uneven, and it's sufficient to think that the southeast alone counts for more than 34% of the total population of the United Kingdom. Unbalanced situations are also seen in regional economies. Unemployment rates in peripheral regions, despite the recent recovery of the British economy, continue to be higher both in relation to the national average and to the average of the southern regions. And with this, I conclude my work. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this brief presentation about the population in England.